so that we can have a record of the public participation that we need to have as FEMA and PEMA require as part of the preparation of Montgomery County's plan. So this is being recorded. I'd ask everybody please to mute during the presentation. If you have input that you'd like to give us, I would prefer that you put it in the chat. So again, so we can have a written record of all of our input during the public meetings. If you have a question or if you need clarification on anything, feel free to use the raise hand function. Hopefully I'll see it. Otherwise, we've got other people on the call that will see it and call it to my attention, and we can answer your questions. But for the most part, if you're going to give us public input, which I hope you're planning to do, please use the chat function again so we can have a written recording of our public contributions. So this is our second public meeting that we've had for the update of our hazard mitigation plan. And there we go. Our agenda this morning is today is pretty simple. First, I want to give you an idea of where we are in the planning process and point you towards some web materials. The meat of our meeting is to review the hazard prioritization process and the matrix that was developed as a part of that process, and to get your input on the rankings, where we put the various hazards. And then I'll briefly cover the next steps that we're hoping to accomplish over the next few months. So we do have a website for this update. It's on the county's website, montcopa.org/planning, and you can find the hazard mitigation site there. There's information on what the plan is supposed to cover. Some of the presentations we made in the past are there as well. Oh, and speaking of web resources, I do want to point out, just so that everybody is clear on what we're covering today. Today's meeting is to cover the hazard prioritization for the hazard mitigation plan. We're not going to be delving into any specific hazards such as Hurricane Ida response or any other issues that are specific to hazards that the county has experienced over the last few years. Also on the county's website, there is information about the response to Hurricane Ida. So if you're looking for that, that's on that montcopa.org website. Let me just briefly give you our schedule. Here we are, midway between April and May. The little red star is our public meeting, which is what we're having today. And over here is where we're looking to, the information we're looking to produce. As I mentioned, we've profiled our hazards, we've assessed the vulnerabilities, we're looking for public input on where we've landed on those. After that, we'll complete our risk assessment, and we'll begin to look at what's called the capability assessment, which looks at how able is the county and how able are the municipalities to respond to these various hazards, and what do we need to do to make us more capable, to give us a better response to the hazards we're facing. That's the final part of the plan we need to prepare, and so we will complete the mitigation action plan based on that, complete the final plan, and submit it for public review and comments, and finally submit it to PEMA and eventually to FEMA for approval and adoption. So we've got a ways to go, but we've come pretty far so far. I also wanted to point out the little yellow, I guess, lightning bolts. They indicate when we've had meetings with the neighboring counties. Many of the surrounding counties, Philadelphia, Bucks, Delaware, and so on, are in the midst or have completed their update to their hazard mitigation plans. And we feel that since we're all working on it together, we have a lot we can learn from each other. So we've been meeting periodically just to discuss roadblocks we've encountered, how we've managed problems, how we're coming with public participation and other requirements. So we're looking to learn from each other there, which I think makes the plan all the stronger.
Hi,
So we
this
do
is
have a planning
Carolyn
team.
McCreary
It's
at
a,
Montgomery Township.
pardon me, yes. Oh, hi,
I'm
Carolyn.
fine, thanks. I apologize for the delay in getting back to you. It's been a little crazy here, but I wanted to follow up on my reaching out to you about the feasibility study at our park. So I have not prepared an RFP because I don't know really what I'm going to be asking for. I know in my mind what we're looking for, but I don't know how to interpret that. And, I can do RFPs for auditors, for engineering things, but
Right.
this one is like so beyond my, my resources.
Right.
We had an organized soccer group, Montgomery United come in, make a presentation to the Board of Supervisors. The board is open to learning more about the possibility of putting turf fields in, but it would be solely our fields. We wouldn't be sharing it with them because we want to be able to obviously reserve them and charge for them, because we would be the only community in this area that has turf fields.
Okay. Hey, Carolyn.
There are some
Carolyn?
residents who live near the park who are opposed to it. So part of any feasibility study also needs to have an environmental component to show that, we're not destroying the woodlands over there and we're not creating Love Canal or something like that.
Right. Hey, Carolyn.
So I wanted to reach
Carolyn, we don't really have the time to go into specifics like this, but let me meet with you offline. I have some time this afternoon, so I can talk to you then. This, as I said, this is kind of like an overarching county plan and specifics. Well, we're not going into specifics today, but let me contact you offline after the after today's meeting. Is that okay? Okay. As I mentioned, we've got a planning team made up of county representatives, the commissioner's office, public safety, public health. Many municipalities are involved in giving us input, and then we've got some institutions and businesses that are providing input as well. We have a smaller writing team, which I should have introduced. I'm sorry. John Lesher, who is on the call, Donna Fabry, who's on the call, and they're both from the Planning Commission, and Joanna Heilig from the Department of Public Safety. We're involved in writing the text that gets reviewed by the planning team, and ultimately we'll have the public will have an opportunity to review as well. So moving on, this is the meat of the meeting that we're having today, the hazard prioritization matrix. And the purpose, I have to move everybody out of the way. Hang on just a second. The process that we've gone through to get to this point is developed by PEMA, the PA Emergency Management Agency, and it's prescribed by them. Everybody has to follow the same process, so we don't have a whole lot of flexibility there, but it's a good process and it's served us well. What we're looking at is something called the risk factor. We're determining a risk factor for each hazard, and the risk factor methodology is a tool that's used to measure the degree of risk for the identified hazards in a particular planning area, in this case in the county, but it also can be used at a municipal level so that you could assess hazards and the degree of risk for a particular hazard at your municipal level. What we're looking to do is identify the most significant threats based on a variety of factors, and then we can address them in the plan. The risk factor system relies mainly on historical data, local knowledge, and a general consensus of opinion. So it's not a strictly scientific approach. There's a fair amount of I guess, personal opinion involved in it. And as you'll see, when we look at some of the results later, from plan update to plan update, they're updated every 5 years, we get a little bit of difference in the rankings. So we're going to go over these rankings today, and I am going to ask you what you think about where these hazards have landed in the prioritization matrix. And if you have input, again, feel free to put that in the chat, or if you have questions, just raise your hand. So that we understand how the process works, a few little definitions. You can see at the top of the slide, the first factor involved is probability. What is the likelihood of a hazard event occurring in any given year? And then there there are levels of probability that are weighted. So unlikely, possible, likely, or highly likely, they each get a different weighting depending on how they're ranked. Also involved is impact. And impact looks at the possible injuries that could occur, damage to property, death. Are the anticipated impacts minor, limited, critical, or catastrophic when a specific hazard event occurs? And again, those get various weightings based on what they're assigned. Three more factors: spatial extent, how large of an area is affected by the hazard event. You can see the levels with the weightings there. There's also warning time. How much lead time do we have associated with an event? Sometimes we know, a tropical storm is making its way up the coast, or a fire could break out in an industrial area. There's differences in lead time there as well. And then duration. How long does the hazard usually last? You could have a winter storm that lasts for several, the impacts last for several days, or just a storm that passes through quickly and it's over in a few hours. So those factors then are identified and weighted, and you can see the formula at the top of the page. Again, it's not a super scientific process, but the risk factor value is assigned by working out this equation. Let me advance. And then these are the results that we've determined. What you see on the slide there is the sliding scale going from high prioritization to low prioritization from left to right. And then underneath in the various colored text, we've got the hazards that are addressed in our hazard mitigation plan. And the first three at the top, upper left, pandemic, and infectious disease, flood, flash flood, and ice jam, and nuclear incident. Those are the top three. And you can see they were rated just above 3 on our matrix scale. Below that, I'm not going to read all of these, but below that, we've got hazards which are still a priority, but they're not quite as high as the first three. I do want to point out that there's two new ones within this group. There's gun violence and there's the opioid accident response. These are new to this plan update. They were considered back in 2017, but they were determined not to have risen to a level where they need to be addressed in the plan. Now we're finding that we need to start thinking about these two additional hazards as well. In our medium category, we've got a mix, transportation, hazardous materials release, some weather-related incidents, and then right in the middle of this list, you see invasive species. That's a new hazard as well. Invasive species has to do with impacts mostly to agricultural endeavors, but it also can affect our county parks and open space. For example, we're experiencing the spotted lanternfly these days, and that is a serious pest, and it has a serious economic impact. Then over to the right, you can see the lower ranked, but still important, these are still going to be addressed in the plan, the lower ranked hazards, dam failure, earthquake, landslide, and so on. So, I mean, there's only 3 levees in Montgomery County. So levee failure could be very important to the folks that are protected by those levees, but over, on a countywide level, most people don't rank something like levee failure very high. So I'll give you a moment just to look at these. We're going to look at this data in a couple different ways, but here's our first listing of them. And again, if you have any comments that you want to make, you could put them in the chat. Or if you need any clarifications, please raise your hand and we will answer those questions. Okay, while you're doing that, let me move on. There we go. Here's just another way of looking at the data. We're kind of double checking the data rankings against our last county hazard mitigation plan, which was completed in 2017. And we're also looking at the Pennsylvania, the statewide hazard mitigation plan, and seeing how these same hazards were ranked, but on a statewide scale. And you can see a couple things about this. Number one, all the way to the left, the pandemic. The pandemic was barely considered in our last plan update, 2017, nobody had even heard of coronavirus. And now it's something on everybody's mind. So of course you'd expect that to rank very high. Other rankings, it's kind of interesting to see how similar certain rankings are. Flooding. Flooding is a hazard that affects everybody in the state. So you'd expect that to be ranked high in the state's plan and in our past plan and in our current plan. But other rankings, such as urban fire and explosion, you can see that Pennsylvania statewide ranks that lower than we rank it. And it's because we're in a more developed area. We've got Philadelphia immediately to our east. We have some urban settings in Montgomery County with our developed boroughs and some of our developed townships. But statewide, there is a lot of rural areas. So urban fire and explosion is probably not as highly ranked statewide as it is here in Montgomery County. So here's another way of looking at it. If anything strikes you about this and the rankings, again, please feel free to put that in the chat. Or if you have any questions on this, just raise your hand and we'll talk about it. And I'm going to move on just to show you what we do with this data. So again, based on the equation I showed you, which has those 5 factors and their weights, we looked at the rankings and came up with the top 3 scoring hazards, which were, again, pandemic, flood, and nuclear incidents. We'd like to know, are you surprised by this outcome? Does this outcome seem logical to you or appropriate? Or are you thinking that we might have ranked these lower or others higher? Again, please put that in the chat and we'll appreciate your comments. We are looking for public input on this plan at this point. What I'd like to do now is to talk about the 3 new hazards that we've added to the plan since our last plan update. The first of these that we'll go over is gun violence. It's underneath a larger heading of war and criminal activity, but gun violence is a leading cause of death in the United States and in our area, unfortunately. And you can see there that gun-related deaths attributed to suicide and homicide in Montgomery County is shown on this chart here. And between 2017 and 2018, white males accounted for over 75% of all gun-related deaths. And this information is also broken down into suicide, homicide, and by gender. So we have looked at this. We've talked to our advising team, and we've assigned this a ranking of 2.8. And based on that, we'll be looking at how to address gun violence as we move into the plan. If you don't agree or if you want to question anything that I'm talking about with these next 3 new hazards, again, feel free to put that in the chat. If you think that gun violence is more important or less important, we'd like to hear from you. Opioid addiction is our next new hazard. It's certainly been in the paper a lot lately, and I think this is why it's sort of risen to everybody's consciousness. As you know, opioids are synthetic substances found in certain prescription pain medicines, and addiction occurs when an individual becomes physically dependent on opioids. Maybe they started taking them for an injury or whatever, but then they've become addicted. The drugs are highly addictive, and that can lead to misuse and in some cases even overdosing. So Pennsylvania ranks this at a 2.2. We're ranking it slightly higher at a 2.7. And we've had quite a bit of coordination with our health department, which we appreciate in developing this section of the plan. Oops, come on. And then our last new hazard, as I mentioned, is invasive species. And I said, I mentioned the spotted lanternfly, but unfortunately, there are many invasive species that Montgomery County faces, and you can see the list there on the right-hand side. And some of them I think are people are very familiar with. The emerald ash borer is one of the reasons why so many ash trees are being removed by municipalities, by landowners for safety reasons. West Nile virus is another one. We're seeing, the name escapes me, the gypsy moth, sorry, that's what it is. Gypsy moth was a big issue for years until we began spraying with BT, a bacteria-based control mechanism, and that has helped. So some of these invasive species can be controlled. Others, we have not determined any control mechanism that we can implement, and there is not a natural control method in the environment that's helping to keep their populations down. So they can become a hazard very quickly, an economic hazard, a hazard to our natural environment. We've ranked it at about a 2.15, which is pretty close to what the Pennsylvania plan ranks it as, a 2.1. So these are the hazards that are in the hazard mitigation plan are first identified by the state planning team, state plan. And after adding war and criminal activity, opioid addiction, and invasive species, Montgomery County has profiles and is eligible for funding on all of the hazards except for the ones you see listed there. These have not risen to the level that we feel they need to be addressed in our plan yet, but they could be addressed in later plans. So we're interested in knowing if you or your family or your community has any experience with these types of hazards. Please let us know, because then we can consider them for our next hazard mitigation plan update in 5 years. Of course, we're not a coastal community, so we don't really have coastal erosion problems, but expansive soils, which have to do with the clay content in some soils, cause them to expand when they get wet. And the other hazards you see listed there may become more important in the future, and we may need to address them in our plan. So if you have any kind of input that you'd like to give us on these 5 potential hazards, please do so in the chat, and we would appreciate that. So as I mentioned, our next steps, we'll be moving from here to the capability assessment, in which we use the information that we gathered during the capability assessment portion of the plan update to formulate a mitigation strategy that will address the hazards in the plan. So the capability assessment has 3 components. You see them listed there. We look at what existing planning and regulatory tools are in effect, such as a floodplain ordinance. We also look at the capacity of the county or the municipality to use those tools effectively. Maybe they need additional training, or maybe the tools themselves need some refining so they can be used more effectively. And then we review how the mitigation plan will be integrated into other planning mechanisms. The hazard mitigation plan is not a plan that is just prepared and stuck on a shelf, and then we check off the box saying, there, we completed the plan. It's integrated into government operations, municipal operations, and other planning mechanisms. So we need to address how that's going to occur moving into the implementation stage. Once we have that, we can move on to the mitigation strategy, where we review goals, objectives, and actions identified in our current plan, which was prepared in 2017, and determine how relevant they are for current conditions. And then where updates need to be made or changes need to be made, we will make those changes so that our plan can be more effective. The remaining goals from our 2017 hazard mitigation plan will be coupled with new ones created during this mitigation strategy and the goals identification process. And the 2 will be joined together to develop a new mitigation strategy. And you can see the 4 steps involved there. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with them. This is what we're getting into coming up over the next few months. There we go. So our next meeting, which you see there, will be sometime in November. If you're interested in taking part in that, keep an eye out, or you can always send us an email saying, please consider me for the inclusion in the next public meeting. That will be sometime in November. But in that next meeting, we'll be discussing the mitigation action plan and inviting the public to comment on the entirety of the 2023 update. And that will be in preparation for finalizing the plan and sending it on to FEMA and PEMA for review. That review by the state and federal agencies can take a long time. It can be sort of a back and forth process, and we need to have everything in place for March 2023 when our current plan expires, so the new plan can take its place. So that's the extent of our formal presentation. I want to thank you for tuning in today, and I can see there's quite a few comments in the chat, which is great. If you have comments or questions, you can see Joanna Heilig's name and contact information there. You also have the meeting invite with our contact information on it. You can contact us with questions. Are there additional questions at this time or comments that you'd like to make? Feel free to raise your hand and we'll give you a chance to make those comments. Yeah, let me think. Paul has raised his hand. Oops.
Jump right in, or just
There
wait?
you go, Paul. I was trying to see if you were unmuted, but yes, go ahead and jump right in.
Yeah, I guess the reason I'm attending here is just to kind of understand the process. And obviously, I work with Pennsylvania Environmental Council, and I'm very interested in the stormwater management programs and flood mitigation. So I've been trying to advise municipalities and others about how you might get projects on the hazard mitigation plan that would address, flooding and so my question would be, like you mentioned, flooding and floodplain ordinances, and how far would that extend to like floodplain restoration or stormwater management? And if we're trying to get these projects on the hazard mitigation plan, how do we do that, or how do the municipalities do it? That's my sort of general question that I had. So
Sure, Paul.
Yeah.
Thanks for asking that.
Yeah.
Yeah, one because it brings up an important aspect of the plan. If there is a specific project listed in the plan, if there's a project listed in the plan, then that project is eligible for funding through FEMA. And in the past, we've had say buyouts, property buyouts. The home that is repeatedly flooded, not just during the severe hurricanes like Hurricane Ida, but just the somewhat frequent intense summer storm. That home is getting flooded every single time. And the homeowners just had enough. And so the homeowner and the township or the municipality together can apply for that property to be bought out, the home raised, and therefore it's no longer affected by floods. Those types of projects, if they're in the plan, we can apply for funding from FEMA. So if you have projects that are hazard mitigation related, say, if there's a stream bank stabilization or stream bank erosion is a problem, but it's not necessarily a hazard. If that stream bank erosion is threatening to cause a road to collapse, or it's impinging on some emergency facilities property, maybe cutting out access to an ambulance corps or something like that, we can list that in the plan, and then it's eligible for funding. If a municipality wants to look at their floodplain ordinance and see how it can be strengthened, and they want to apply for funding for that, we can list that in the plan. What we're tending to do more in this plan update is to be slightly more general. Rather than list a specific property in a specific municipality, we may say, all of the properties along the Perkiomen Creek in, this municipality should be considered for floodproofing or more buyouts. And that then gives all of those properties and the municipality an opportunity to go for funding to accomplish either of those, should they decide to do so.
Could I just ask again, like how,
Sure.
could it be general stormwater management? Like you're not necessarily in the floodplain restoration, sure, it's in the floodplain, but how about we're going to naturalize basins or, you know, green infrastructure, is that, and better manage stormwater? How would that tie in to this?
That's, well, it's not exactly a hazard. If it can be tied to a specific hazard, if you could say, excuse me, this, you know, this school, this hospital, this important piece of infrastructure is threatened by flooding, and it can be determined that, you know, the problem is these, you know, half a dozen basins in this drainage area are not designed properly, or are, you know, undersized or whatever, and that's what's causing the flooding problem. You know, there's a chance that that could get funded. But general green stormwater infrastructure, you know, improvements, retrofits to basins, that doesn't really rise to the level of hazard mitigation, and so it's not eligible.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Brandon, why don't you go ahead? I see your hand is up.
Hey, Drew, thanks. I was just wondering, once this plan is, you know, adopted, you know, if it's adopted by the commissioners as is, would there be any thought of the county of kind of mirroring what MCPC does so well with the Montco 2040 program, where you have an implementation grant program that would help kind of achieve the, you know, the objectives outlined in Montco 2040, but more geared towards mitigation? Because I know, you know, if something along the lines of that were to be considered by the county, I wouldn't believe it would be hard to believe that a lot of munis would kind of jump at that opportunity
Sure.
as well.
Yeah, Brandon, I'll be honest, we're not at this point considering any kind of a funding program. The purpose of the plan is to identify, one of the purposes of the plan is to identify projects that then can be funded when, you know, say a disaster is declared and relief money comes to the county. Then we can use that money to fund various projects. Or again, if there is FEMA money available for disaster release or mitigation planning, if a project's listed in the plan, it can apply for that funding. So this is more of a planning process that identifies projects that can be funded at a state or federal level. But we do cooperate with municipalities in kind of putting those applications together. We have helped out in the past with, as I mentioned, with home buyouts and so on.
Understood. Thanks.
Yeah. Are there any other questions? Okay, well, hearing none, I guess that's my cue to close the meeting. I want to thank everybody for participating today. And I appreciate your input. We will be considering your comments over the next few weeks. And as I say, incorporating the ones that are appropriate into our plan. So, you know, thanks for your participation, and be on the lookout for the November announcement for the public hearing, so we can, again, get your comments on the final plan. So everybody enjoy your afternoon, and thank you all for attending.
Thanks a lot.
Sure, thank you.